Her first week on the job had already started at St. Augustine's Hospital, a wavering, antiquated building in the city that had been here for over 100 years. It had a history as old and steeped in folklore of life or death, hope or futility as the city where it lived. But there were also far more sinister rumors. And as happens when people are made to work together for long periods of time in large groups, the staff began whispering tales of phantom hauntings throughout closed sections like those on a sequestered night crew. Ellie, despite what you may have inferred so far, did not believe in ghosts. A pragmatic woman, hard-working and eager to commence her first night duty. As she entered the hospital that evening, a cold wind rushed and overwhelmed her. Even though the building itself was kept in good order, she always felt a chill as it passed through to her bones. It must just be nerves, of course. Her pulse rate would go up a little, working by night for the first time. Ellie was about to make her way onto the floor when she was intercepted by the night supervisor. Nurse Hayes, who handed Ellie an assignment for the evening, will do a lot of routine work tonight, but remember to keep an eye on the patients in Ward C. It was really quietest block of the hospital. You should be able to slide into your duties with minimal Jinzu force. Ellie nodded, and she was relieved by the simple question. Ward C, a broader, much older aspect of the school commonly employed for excess during peak times. This evening it was only home to a handful of granny-type patients, all in the retrieval stages from various sickness. It seemed to be the perfect way in which to transition into night shift. It started off as a rather uneventful few hours. She checked in on the patients, gave out their medications, and made her rounds. The beeping of the monitors and whispers in one heart is all that was breaking through its halls. The closer it got to midnight, the more Ellie was tempted by that long dark hallway out into Ward C. The corridor was creepy, framed in old and worn photos from the first days of the hospital. Their eyes tracked her as she passed. She sped up, hoping to run away from the rising disquiet in her stomach. Upon arrival at the Ward C entrance, there was a pause. A crack in the door allowed some light to leak out, leaving one to wonder whether it happened or not. She knew she had shut the door when they went to bed. Maybe one of the patients had stood up and was in need. She pulled the door open and went in. The ward itself was fairly quiet, only the steady breathing of a couple patients could be heard. The beds were crisply made, the monitors blinking quietly. Everything seemed in order. Ellie visited each patient and made sure they were comfortable in bed. Near the last bed, however, she saw something odd. The bed was empty. Ellie furrowed her brow as she read the chart at bedside. The person who was in that bed should have been Mrs. Simmons, an elderly woman finally recovering from a stroke. Ellie felt a pang of worry. Did Mrs. Simmons strike out wandering again? It wasn't unheard of for older patients to become confused, especially in the dark. Ellie was walking toward the door from which she had entered to go look for Mrs. Simmons, but suddenly she stopped and turned around. Soft whispering began to fill the room, so faint at first she believed her mind was playing tricks again. She leant in still further, but the murmur was becoming louder and clearer. It was coming from my hallway. Ellie felt her heart hammering as she stepped out into the hall. Foolish, it whispered back at us, that is all we were to those cowards. A lone gentle plea in the dark chambers of the past. She preceded it, the footsteps in her high heels a click on the hollow corridor. The hospital felt the way it looked now, shadows looming taller and air-weighted. The whispering brought her to a section of the hospital that was obsolete, an entire wing shut down long time ago, the doors locked, the windows barricaded, but before Ellie could reach it, one of the doors swung open by itself and blackness was suddenly revealed inside. Ellie almost goes back, her mind screaming at her to turn around, asking for help, and yet something pulled her inside to answer the whispering voice, of course. It was icy in the room and smelled of disinfectant sour, not so distant from metallic bitterness. As her flashlight shone through the darkness, broken equipment from years gone by and decaying beds lined these rooms. Once a ward, now abandoned and lost to time. Yet the further into the room she went, that soft whisper turned urgently louder. When Ellie came to the end of the ward, her heart was pounding. A woman in a hospital gown stood facing away from Ellie in that corner. The woman had long matted hair, and her skin looked as though it was somewhere between pale and translucent in the dim lighting. Mrs. Simmons Ellie sighed softly and called out, but no, this was not the missing patient. The shape stayed rock solid, no reaction to her features. Ellie edged closer, a knot forming in her throat. She raised one hand and the woman spun to her, eyes wide with pain and fear. She just laid there, eyes wide with terror and her mouth moving like she was running for dog catcher, but without the volume. Her heart hammered in her chest as Ellie stepped back, falling to the ground and scrabbling backwards away from the woman. The woman extended her hand and it went through Ellie's arm like a draft. Ellie jumped and staggered back, dropping her flashlight. The light crackled and writhed, the shadows creeping across and dancing on the walls. The whispers continued, more urgent and aggressive, until Ellie was overwhelmed by a din of voices. They crowded around her, begging and wailing. She covered her ears and wished the sound away in vain. Those voices were inside her, unremovable. Ellie could pick out shards of words through the mayhem, phrases that were nothing but awful. Help us stuck can't, he had to slip up somewhere and start making sense, pain of betrayal from. Ellie was on her feet as soon as Trudeau had passed, refusing to watch whatever horror awaited the ugly sob, and grabbed my torch before running out of the room. The voices moved with her, becoming orders of magnitude louder the closer she got to turning right down a prepared corridor. She only stopped when she made it into the relative safety of somewhere in the main hospital, with sounds that were growing more and more distant as her foot crossed over to brightly lit hallway. Ellie gasped for air, leaning into the wall as her heart felt like it was about to explode. And she knew, like we all do, you cannot unsee it. He had known something was deeply off about the hospital, whatever was slumbering in its bowels for so long. Not one to quit searching for answers, Ellie went on over to the archives. If there were secrets locked in these walls, she would uncover them. The archives were hidden in a cobweb-draped corner of the hospital, its yellowing records and notes from ambulances, patients growing older than even Harold. Hours later, her hands shaking at what she found in those papers. Experiments had been performed, and they were in fact heinous experiments that took place during the 1950s at this hospital. Mental patients were experimented on and tortured, their agony whitewashed away with time. But these tests didn't just stop there. The records showed that a doctor, Dr. Blackwell, has continued the research for years after the program ceased. Blackwell's name is actually John Braun. In reality, he had been performing his experiments in the deserted part of the wing and used patients against their wills. The official records recorded simply missing or worse, as Markovitz writes, transferred. As Ellie read the accounts, she felt sick, kept thinking, that is this even real, of what had happened behind these walls? The patient's pain never ceased. Their souls lingered in the hospital, their suffering silently screaming through each hall. And immediately after, Ellie had the truth, and she knew that something had to be done. She could not abandon these souls to silently endure in a place where such agonies were once known. She called the administrator of the hospital for honesty and to have these spirits rest in peace. Over the next couple of days, a full investigation was underway. The ward shut down and the building was closed, already leaving behind a memory for all those patients who had suffered or died within its great walls. The secrets of St. Augustine came to light, and the hospital started on a long journey toward recovery. But Ellie would never stop thinking about that night shift in. In her dreams, she saw the specters of those patients staring at her in reproach, their murmurs still resonating with meaning. Continuing to work at St. Augustine, she made sure never to step foot in the old wing again. The spirits of those who had experienced the worst things there would never leave. As long as that hospital stood, it hid a great number of dirty little secrets behind its walls, yet Ellie found solace in the fact that she had exposed their tale, that for once they had a voice due to her. And every night, as she would roam the halls of Vavonby Jail, you could feel them with her calm presence, making sure their rest had been earned. Ethan shot up, panting with a thumping heart and cold sweat beading his forehead. He tried to remember how he had gotten here, but the memory was only a blur. When he awoke, it was to find himself lying on the bench of a hard cot inside some room with only a flickering light high overhead. The white peeling paint, the thick fucking dust and decay, it felt as if a heavy weight was pressing down on him, and then he sat up abruptly, groaning when his eyes noticed that the room in Old Hospital Ward 1 like of them had not been used for at least 2 decades. Fear started welling up inside him. Ethan struggled to recall how he ended up here, but the latest tangible memory was his closing of one late night at work. Had he been drugged? Kidnapped? His head spun as he examined his surroundings: tarnished medical equipment, an unkempt bed with cream bedsheets covered in splotches of red, and a single flickering fluorescent light hanging from the ceiling. With great effort, he stood up on the cool floor. There was nothing but the dim, flickering light outside in the dark hallway. It was oppressively silent in the room, save for the occasionally creaking of whatever plumbing lurked inside the ancient structure. Ethan stepped carefully into the hallway. The place was silent except for faint dripping of water from afar. The faded sepia images of patients and staff lined the walls, their faces spectral in the gloom. The air smelled heavy with damp and something else he couldn't quite identify metallic. He could sometimes hear the sound of distant footsteps, but when he turned around, there was nothing. With each passing room, he grew more confident, pained by the sight of death and rotting decay. Ethan's gaze drifted to his options. What to do now? The hospital seemed never-ending, and he had to find a way out. He turned the corner and stood, mouth agape. In front of him stood a man in a ripped hospital gown, a patient, standing still, face shrouded in the night. "Hello," Ethan called out. "Is someone there?" The man stood still, took a step, and in an instant, the man disappeared. "No," he called into the hall. No, he took a step, and though there was nothing but an empty room behind him, he felt eyes watching him. More determined than ever to find an exit, Ethan pushed open door after door, glass placed in darkness, some with broken furniture, some filled with forgotten medicine. With each step, he knew what this place was alive with malevolence. Eyes unnoticed and unseen watched him as he went, trapped in this cellar. Sweat and nervous energy hummed through his bloodstream. The fear within him solidified, and the abandoned hospital seemed more alive than ever. At last, he entered an operating room and shook when the door creaked behind him. The floor beneath him was covered in blood, stained rust, and broken glass. Before Ethan could reply, the temperature dropped and he saw his breath. Whispers started up, soft, indistinct words floating in his ears from all around him. He whirled around, looking for the voices, but saw only blackness. "Is anyone here?" he called out again, his voice shaking. The suggestions in my head morphed from whispers to shouts, as if they emerged from within the walls, wrought with woe and despair. This news made Ethan feel more and more of a sense of emergency. He needed to be out of here before whatever hell was chasing him found it. Whispers followed. They could hear them better now, ... their whispers echoing wherever Holix went. The shadows reached for him, deformed by the more vehement flickerings of light. He collided with something as he turned a corner or someone. Ethan absorbed a punch and collapsed to the slush-covered street, almost tripping over that vapor in human form, which then was gone. A twisted face of a woman. It sent a shiver of fear down Ethan's spine. It was then that he realized he wasn't alone in this place at all, but with every other person who had ever been. Ethan had been desperate to leave, but the hospital felt as though it were nearly in motion with him, the hallways appearing to stretch and twist. It was like the building itself lived, and somehow ensnared him inside its crumbling skin. Eventually, he spotted a stairway and followed it down, hoping that this time maybe the stairs would lead him to where he needed to go. The stairwell was dark and damp, the air echoing with noise made of rats fleeing our approach and water drops that fell unattentive. At the base, a little light peeped out of some corridor with an exit siren, A gasp of relief followed by a quick step in that direction. As he got to the door, it slammed shut with a loud bang. It was locked tight. Ethan tried the handle. Terror clawed at him, and the murmurs rose to a dizzying roar that screamed in his mind. He could sense them inside him. Their torment was nearly harvestable. Ethan was desperate. He pounded on the door, screaming for help, but nobody answered. The whisper became wails of torture, and I could swear their anguish grew. He needed to leave before the spirits of yesteryear swallowed him whole. With one final burst of desperation, Ethan looked around the room for something to break down the door with. Taking a deep breath, he picked up the rusty pipe and started pounding on door with all his might. Metal screeched against wood, the door stood firm. As Ethan felt like all was lost, a very distant creak sounded behind him of the door opening. Then he looked up to discover a tiny beam of light stretching from the other side through a narrow passageway in the wall. Ethan's hopes lifted as he wriggled his way through, only to find himself in a secret corridor. The whispers were still barely audible, with the air only a fraction more breathable than in the room. He walked along the hall to a little damaged window. The view of the world outside brought him to tears. Ethan shot his leer back to the window intended and tumbled out onto the lawn. He glanced at the hospital, and what was only moments before a proud edifice now loomed inky black against the night. He realized he had only just escaped the grip of whatever horrors lurked within those walls. He took a step back from the hospital and hesitated for one last look. The hospital was quiet, its secrets locked deep in the walls. He never told anyone his tale, but that night stuck with him forever. The ghosts of St. Augustine's had nearly swallowed him whole, but he'd managed to climb out their gullet and walk away from the memories one captain held near an unmarked graze. Ethan Blake's eyes sprung open, and as his vision filled with the stabbing white light of a barely fluorescent ceiling bulb, his eyes batting back and forth, trying to focus. A tiny, dark room with a pervasive stale smell of indifference. He lay in a narrow cot, his head sunk into bottomless pillows of cracked and soiled linen. His mind raced to try and remember how he had gotten here, a sense of panic surging through him with no details present in his memory. Ethan popped up, his chest heavy with beating hearts. The walls of the building were cracked and peeling, shedding an old forgotten skin. We had never seen white people before. The whites looked at us strangely, and old medical equipment covered in dust sat like reminders of a forgotten era. A deep dread fell upon him. It was one of those places that felt deserted, as though time had forgotten about it. Inhaling a deep breath to calm his nerves, he knew only that he left a meeting late at night, and then nothing. His knees trembling, he got up and limped his way to the door. With a groan, it opened as he forced it back. The corridor beyond was quiet, the stillness broken only when murky water from a broken pit would fall. Faded, yellow pictures of patients and staff papered the walls, all grimacing like residents in an old-age facility. He shivered as his footsteps echoed through the hallway in deafening silence. The only sound was the echo of Ethan's footsteps as he continued further inside. The building looked huge, and a maze of corridors twisted away down its endless length. The temperature seemed to drop with every step he took, growing colder, his breath visible in the air. He wanted to ignore the fact that it made him feel nervous just looking at it, and exit seemed like a good idea. Then he came to a bend and stopped. In one of the rooms there was an ethereal and faint glow. His fear dissipated under the power of his curiosity, and he crept towards the light. He could see that the door was open a crack, and there was a low flickering light shining out of it. He opened the door crack and peeked inside. It was an old operating theater. In the ceiling, those dimly flickering lights. On a rickety trolley sat its components, body parts that now lay strewn across Hell's battlefield and rusted surgical tools. The floor beneath them was marred by bloodstained patches so dark they seemed to suck in the light around it like some huge galactic sponge of meat and gore, brought here by maniacal forces for reasons long lost or forgotten, perhaps never known at all. But regardless, nothing ever escapes Flux crawling up from down below. An ancient examination table sat in the middle of the room under a worn, dirty sheet. The sweet, sickly scent of death hung heavy in the air, with a tangy metallic note. Ethan's heart began to race as he moved a little closer into the room. Shadows created by the flickering light became elongated and eerie as they twisted across walls. A chill ran up his back and he automatically turned to look behind him. It was then that he saw a dark, shadowy figure at the far corner of his room. There was a vague sort of shape and ominousness to its presence. He twisted on the spot, but as soon as his head had turned, the figure was gone. His breathing came fast, and he struggled to keep his panic under control. "Hello, you have a decent voice, believe me," he said in a trembling tone. "Is anyone there?" There was an awkward silence. Ethan walked timidly through the room, checking every corner of it. When he arrived to the door, getting ready to exit that place, several patterns made of prints and scratches drew his attention directly on the ground. His unease deepened. The lights in the corridor flickered violently, after which a loud bang reverberated. With a racing heart, Ethan leapt up and spun. He quickly moved to the door. It slammed itself forcefully closed. It would not open. He tugged at the door, but nothing happened. Then it dawned on him that he was in fact trapped. He looks around the room after that to see if there was another way out of which they could slip away. Looking up the wall, he caught sight of a small window covered in dirt and cobwebs. Then he climbed on his chair and, using more energy, attempted to break open the window. While he worked, there were sounds of faint, eerie whispers so soft as to be near lost in his own frantic breaths. The whispers became louder, and Ethan could pick up on elements of words, cries for mercy, shouts of pain. A cold draft met him, and the place could grow colder. Shadows slunk along the walls, taking shape into vague forms which appeared to fix gaze upon him with malicious intent. At long last, the window shattered, and he squeezed through, rubbing his skin along the sharp edges. Crashing into the hospital grounds, he landed hard on a lawn that was full of weeds. The windows that lined the high walls of this knowledge fortress glowed ominous and dark when he gazed back at it. It was as if the hospital itself swelled with an almost evil life force. Ethan pushed his way out of the hospital, heart pounding in his chest, one final look behind him. Those showed a figure dark and lurking in one of the windows above, staring back at him. She looked at him and he ran, running away until he was in the lights on the street just outside of hospital property. Ethan gasped, filling his lungs with the night. He glanced behind to the hospital as it only shone in a bleak outline of night. Though the experience had him rattled, he found himself unscathed from their sinister presence. The following morning, Ethan went to the police but kept some of the gruesome aspects a secret. The hospital really was haunted by the ghosts of its past, and they had nearly swarmed him up. He wondered, after driving away from St. Augustine's that night, if he had not just avoided something worse than anything his mind could even begin to contemplate. And the ghostly echoes of that hospital would be a haunting memory, nothing but an icy cold reminder from what horrors had escaped down in the abandoned wing. By the time the supernatural searching pro Derek Mason arrived at St. Augustine's Hospital, gathering darkness was all but invisible to any human observer. This hospital, a vast and dilapidated complex that had been long since mythologized into urban legend lore. It had become a hub for thrill seekers and researchers over rumors of heinous experiments, early deaths brought on by illness in their standard form, or feigned illness witching hours lighted the circle to attract restless spirits. Derek was coming with years of experience on the hunt for meetings and a name as someone who never stops digging to get at what we can really see. Derek went into the hospital armed for action with his infrared cameras, EVP electronic voice phenomena recorders, and EMF electromagnetic field detectors. When the thick front doors opened, they groaned under some long-forgotten effort to reveal a dimly in which no one was present. The air was dank, heavy with the stench of mold and rot. The grandeur of the hospital had long dissipated, leaving an eerie void. In the old schoolhouse, Derek made himself at home in what used to be called the administration office. The room was filled with dust, old pieces of paper, and corpses of broken furniture scattered everywhere, a big window pane that looked onto the asphyxiated grounds. A few early checks were done by him which gave back certain minor ordinances fluctuation that was common in such antiquated establishments. Certain he had nothing to fear just yet, Derek moved on with his search. The hospital was dead silent, everything the water drops and an owl. The halls were lined with puke green peeling wallpaper and old rusting medical equipment. The sound of Derek's footsteps echoed from room to room as he pulled out cameras and recording devices. It was nearing midnight, and Derek thought he would explore the abandoned psychiatric ward with one of the darkest pasts. The ward had closed decades before amid reports of institutionalized mistreatment. Derek felt a shiver go down his spine as the prospect of exploring this infamous area, but he had made it so far due to nothing more than curiosity and professional stubbornness. Derek did not even bother to knock before he entered the ward, and by doing so was arrested immediately after crossing into it. Such was the sense of desolation that wafted in like a mist on freezing cold night. After a while, the temperature dropped and his breath began to show in the cold, stuffy air. The EMF meter he was using went off the chart and started to spiral before beeping as loud as it could when arriving near where they're used to keep nurses. One of the bulbs overhead was blinking on and off, stretching dancing shadows along all walls and grays. When they arrived at the school, Derek placed his gear out and started some EVP. "Is anyone here with me?" he said, shouting through the open area. It appeared not long after the question, subtle, soft-spoken, and almost inaudible. Derek shifted in his gear and pressed forward with more questions to elicit a better answer. Out of nowhere came a loud crash through the ward. As Daniel spun around, heart pounding, his flashlight cutting through the darkness and revealing nothing but overturned furniture. The air felt denser and the murmurs got louder until they merged into an indistinguishable whisper coming from all sides. He approached the area of disturbance cautiously, alerting his senses to any kind of movement. The corridor appeared unending. The maze continually shifted, causing him to be immensely disoriented. The whispers became disembodied sounds, begging and enraged, echoing through the tomb brick walls, a breath of premonition and atmosphere. The would-be gurney horse squealed and galloped off into the darkness as they approached a large, dilapidated operating theater, where suddenly Derek's chest tightened. When the chill deepened, and he watched freezing smoke slowly meandering through innumerable chunks of cloud-like formation. The lights overhead flickered so violently that the shadows on the walls seemed to writhe and twist in agony. The needle of Derek's EMF meter went frantic, as if being pulled violently by a force unseen. And hovering in the middle of the theater was a dark figure, somehow black against all that darkness. Derek's flashlight flickered and went out, leaving him in the dark. The figure did not budge, a heavy and threatening presence. Derek fumbled, standing up to find his flashlight is stopping it on. The figure stepped closer, the shape refined, and a pitiful face emerged, disfigured in pain. Derek felt as if there was 1,000 familiar sarcastic responses on the tip of his tongue, but ultimately they all were lost in an attempt to escape from whatever unseen cold had gripped tightly at his arm. Derek took off sprinting down the hallway, desperate to get away as that chariot of doom chased him around the layout of the hospital that she knew so well had been turned into a labyrinth as walls clogged and concealed doorways. Derek felt it hammer in his chest, even as he skirted walls to make a beeline for the lobby. The murmurs evolved into a loud cry and the tones reverberating from one wall to another, every which housed both agony as well rage. The hospital suddenly became spooky.is, if by some game of spirits haunting its dark past. He tripped around a corner and into what he hoped was just a storage room. He clanged the door closed behind him and leaned against it to catch his breath. Inside the room, on shelves upon faded and unreadable labels, there was a host of old medical supplies. The dust hung thick in the air, a smell of old rot permeated. Derek is having equipment difficulties as well as sporadic readings from the electronic devices. The stifling air began to press down on him, a physical sensation that whispered of the nearness of other souls. Outside the door, screams were wild and raging through their floor. It cursed their name. Right, that was it. Derek clenched his fists and screamed. It took all the energy left in him, but he wriggled free from both of their grips. He picked up a metal pipe from the floor and used it to bust out one of those little windows above his head. It was dirty and only partially open, but it could work as an escape route. He then crawled through the window, his arms getting cut on the jagged edges. The night sky a welcome retreat from the overcrowded and gloomy grounds of the hospital. Derek tumbled to the grass, heaving and gasping. As he turned toward the hospital, they remained watching from shadowy shapes in the windows, their figures silhouetted against dark interiors. There was a dark energy about the building that seemed to pulse like an inhuman heartbeat, the malevolence of which served as little more than confirmation of heinous acts committed within those walls. Derek stepped out of the hospital, his heartbeat still pulsing. It had been a terrible ordeal, but he was alive. He had all the evidence he needed, but his confrontation with those evil spirits shook him to his core. Derek took one last look in the rearview mirror as he pulled out of St. Augustine's. The hospital was quiet, its past still surrounding the old rotting walls. St. Augustine's shadows would haunt me forever, a reminder of the darkness concealed behind its forsaken doors. Greg Turner had worked as a security guard at the abandoned St. Augustine's Hospital for over 10 years, but he'd never been asked to pull a night shift before that Wednesday evening. It was simple enough work patrolling site and keeping a watch over the cameras to make sure nobody tried breaking in. Greg had heard the local Lore Filson hospitals haunted. Local teenagers told stories of ghostly apparitions moving through its halls and weird noises rumbled from within. Just typical urban legend stuff. The hospital was large. Old and crumbling clay brick walls were now overlaid with grime over the extensive growth of ivy that enveloped it. The inside was in just as bad shape, wallpaper peeling, windows broken out, and abandoned medical equipment everywhere. The heavy doors creaked. Greg made his way through the front entrance. The lobby was nearly dark, excluding the one flickering overhead bulb. Greg grabbed his flashlight, walkie-talkie, and keys for the night rounds. The halls were all silent. A drop of water hit the ground now, and then much like our heartless footsteps, it smelled of long, mothballed air and dust. Moving throughout the building, he confirmed through his security monitors and scrawled down notes wherever things appeared more troublesome. It all looked right empty and out of mind. Just as was going to relax in for an uneventful night, he heard something that caused him to pause. Somewhere way off in the distance it was light and distant, but so clearly rhythmic a thud. He did stop though. Stopped in absolute silence when the beam of his flashlight shone long shadows on walls that seemed like home. The noise seemed to be from further inside the hospital. Frowning, he turned to investigate, trying not to acknowledge the creeping suspicion. That night, Greg followed the sound to the hospital's unused wing, which had been closed and barred shut, but where he was told to walk through periodically. The thumping got louder and was soon joined by a chorus of groans as he started walking up the corridor. His heart began to race. Down the corridor, he came to a pair of heavy, rusted doors. Behind the thumping sounds, a low rhythmic chanting now played, and Greg could see dim light spilling through around the edges of those doors. Hesitant and curious, he swung the door open. What Amadou saw before him was the stuff of nightmares. The candles flickered in his room, the glow of them so bleak and washed as a circle on top. At the room center, a pack of limbs in torn hospital smocks jerked back and forth together to match it. Their voices were deep but guttural, and it felt as though the caverns echoed back with this ancient, malevolent power. Greg looked around in stunned shock, his flashlight providing light. Their faces were drawn and sunken, the light in their eyes snuffed out. It was as though they were worshipping, compelled by an unseen force. The air reeked of ancient blood and rock. One of the figures pivoted its head slowly to face Greg and locked his eyes with their empty, dead stare. The chant ceased suddenly, and the other figures began to turn their attention in his direction as well. The stifling aura became denser still, and Greg shivered coldly. Millie heard it first, the chanting soft at first, but growing louder in a discordant chorus as Greg spun around and sprinted down the corridor in fright. The hospital appeared a never-ending labyrinth of hallways that zigzagged through the building, and even though he had walked before now in this emergency situation, it was all new to him. The shadows seemed to close in on him, and he could hear it creeping up once more, that far-off drum of terror distinct from the howling haunting enough for something beyond memory itself or someone to be hunting them. After what felt like an eternity, he managed to make it back to the security office. He picked up his walkie-talkie to get in touch with the main office, but he could only hear static coming through on it. They had once again lost all signal. He felt frustration and fear as it all swirled together in him, the crushing realization that he was truly alone. Greg was desperate to leave and spent a mild eternity combing through the office for an escape opportunity. He saw that the security monitors were frozen from interference between static, cameras taken out. The room with the shadows turning and changing, writhing as if they themselves were trying to strangle him. When he turned to walk out, the noise retaliates and everything goes dark. The overhead lights blinked off, throwing him into blackness. The oppressive air he felt earlier now materialized, its malignancy bearing down on him. The sound continued, becoming a faint rhythmic thumping, and with it the softest of whispers tracking in parallel to its unholy rhythm. Just then, his flashlight flickered off and he was blind. The whispers of voices surrounded him. .is carried recordings, and other audio logs gathered together to form coherent vibrations with volume that is continuously increasing into his ears. The air was cold, icy winter its bite, and he felt something lingering there, constricting the airflow around him. Frantically, he stumbled through the dark, looking for an escape. Greg finally found an emergency exit in his manic state. He fell through the door and landed in the brisk night air. He turned, gasping for breath, as the outline of hospital stood tall in the dark night, its windows dark and menacing as the building itself seemed to pulse with an evil life force of its own. He stumbled his way to the car, shaking hands out of sync with fitfully on-off keys. It had shaken him to his very core and scared the hell out of him. He looked back one last time as he drove off from the hospital. The building loomed eerily in the darkness, its haunted history well preserved within its empty walls. It was the worst nightmare he could have ever dreamt of. Class had told Greg that St. Augustine's Hospital was definitely not empty, aside from the spirits of its long-suffering dead and damned residents whose souls are bound in a hellish purgatory forever. JSON property, the ghosts of the hospital had fewer almost succeeded in taking him as well. And he would carry forever with his memory that horrid countenance lurking among some fleshless, smiling face shambling through corridors St. Augustine's. Greg was going to leave the city that day with a vow in his heart never to return. The memories that he had seen were something for him to carry, a burden of what was beyond the dark fortifications crumbling within hospitals. My name is Selena, and I've always been a skeptic. Ghosts, spirits, the supernatural, it's all nonsense to me. At least it was. It started on a cold autumn night, the wind howling outside as the leaves danced in the streets. I was drawn to the old hospital on the edge of town, an abandoned relic of the past. The locals called it St. Mercy's Asylum, but I just called it a rundown building. It was a dare, of course. My friends, always eager to exploit my disbelief, challenged me to spend a night inside. You'll see nothing they said, but if you come out screaming, you owe us dinner for a week. I took the challenge with a smirk, pocketing my phone and flashlight. The hospital loomed ahead, its windows shattered, and the front doors hanging off their hinges. The air was thick with decay, and as I stepped inside, the dust greeted me like an old friend. The entrance hall was vast, with peeling wallpaper and rusting fixtures. I explored with caution, the beam of my flashlight flickering as if hesitant to reveal the secrets hidden in the shadows. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. It felt alive, as if it was breathing, watching me. I moved deeper into the hospital, past the reception desk covered in mold and old papers. The walls were lined with old patient files, some still intact, telling stories of those who had once been trapped within these walls. But something felt wrong, as if the files weren't just records, they were warnings. My heart began to race, and I tried to rationalize it. It was just my imagination, a trick of the mind. But then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from down the hall. I froze, listening, trying to determine if it was real or just a product of my anxiety. Help. The voice was soft, weak, but unmistakably human. My skepticism wavered as I slowly made my way toward the sound. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, the walls narrowing as if closing in. I reached a set of double doors, the sign above them reading maternity ward. I pushed open the doors, the hinges groaning in protest. The ward was a nightmare frozen in time. Rusted beds lined the walls, and old medical equipment lay scattered across the floor. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic, like blood. As I ventured further, I saw the source of the whisperer figure barely visible in the dim light, standing at the far end of the room. It was a woman, her back to me, dressed in a tattered hospital gown. Her hair was matted, and she swayed slightly as if in pain. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. I took a cautious step forward, and as I did, the room seemed to shift. The walls pulsed, the shadows deepening, and the temperature plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I felt a presence, something ancient and malevolent looming over me. The woman turned slowly, her face gaunt, eyes hollow. She stared at me with an intensity that pierced my very soul. Then she spoke, her voice a haunting echo. "Why did you come here?" I opened my mouth to answer, but no sound came out. The fear was paralyzing, a cold grip around my throat. The woman took a step forward, and I stumbled back, tripping over a rusted bed frame. As I fell, the world around me changed. When I hit the ground, I wasn't in the maternity ward anymore. I was in a dark, narrow hallway, the walls lined with flickering lights. The smell of antiseptic and rot filled the air, and I could hear the distant sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming toward me. I scrambled to my feet, disoriented and panicked. The hospital was no longer abandoned. It was alive, functioning, but with a sinister edge. The walls bled, the lights buzzed ominously, and the shadows moved with purpose. Selena, the voice, came from all directions, surrounding me, suffocating me. It was the woman, but it was also something else, something darker. "You shouldn't have come." I ran, my heart pounding in my chest, the walls closing in around me. The footsteps were getting closer, and I could feel the presence behind me, a cold, malevolent force that wanted to consume me. I burst through a set of double doors and found myself in the operating room. The scene before me was horrific. Doctors, or what remained of them, were performing surgery on a patient, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of flesh and bone. The patient screamed, a sound that pierced through the madness and filled me with an indescribable terror. "Help me," the patient's voice was desperate, and as I looked closer, I saw that the patient was ME. I was on that table, being cut open, my blood pooling on the floor. I could feel the pain, the searing agony of the scalpel slicing through my flesh. I stumbled back, unable to comprehend the horror before me. The walls pulsed with a dark energy, and the room was filled with the sound of my own screams. I was trapped in a nightmare, a place where reality and insanity intertwined. The doctors turned to me, their hollow eyes locking onto mine. "You can't escape, Selena," they whispered in unison, their voices blending into a cacophony of torment. "You belong here now." The words struck me like a physical blow, and I realized the truth. I had become part of the hospital, a prisoner in this hellish place. The figure of the woman appeared beside me, her face a mask of sorrow and pain. "This is your fate," she said softly, her voice filled with regret. "You were drawn here, just like all the others. There's no way out." But I refused to accept it. I wasn't like the others. I was stronger. I was still alive. I wouldn't let this place consume me. With a surge of defiance, I turned and ran, determined to find an exit, to break free from the nightmare. The hospital twisted around me, the hallway shifting, the doors slamming shut as I passed. The air grew colder, and the shadows reached out, trying to pull me into their depths. But I kept running, fueled by a primal instinct to survive. Finally, I reached the entrance hall, the front doors in sight. They were open, the night air beckoning me, promising freedom. I could hear the whispers behind me, the voices of the damned urging me to stay, to join them. But I didn't look back. I burst through the doors and into the night, the cold wind hitting me like a slap in the face. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing on the ground, gasping for breath. The hospital loomed behind me, silent, dark, as if it had never been alive. But I knew the truth. I had escaped, but I wasn't free. The hospital had marked me, and I could feel its presence lingering in my mind, a dark shadow that would never leave. I never spoke of what happened that night. My friends asked, but I just smiled and told them they were right, there was nothing there. But inside, I knew that wasn't true. The hospital had shown me things that no one should ever see. I moved away, far from that cursed place, but the memories followed me. Every night, I dreamed of the hospital, of the woman, of the operating room. And every night, I woke up screaming, the phantom pain of the scalpel still fresh in my mind. I tried to forget, to live a normal life, but the hospital wouldn't let me. It was always there, in the shadows, in the corners of my mind, waiting for the day I would return. Because I knew, deep down, that I would go back. I had no choice. The hospital had claimed me, and one day it would come to collect. My name is Gareth, and I work as a paranormal investigator. I've spent years debunking supposed hauntings, exposing frauds, and occasionally encountering the unexplainable. When I received a tip about the abandoned Ravenwood Hospital, a place notorious for its dark past, I was skeptical but intrigued. The stories were all the same: patients vanishing, doctors losing their minds, and a curse that lingered long after the hospital shut down. I arrived on a stormy night, the rain pouring down in sheets as I approached the looming structure. The hospital stood isolated on a hill, its windows like empty eyes staring down at the world. The wind howled through the broken panes, and the building itself seemed to groan under the weight of its own history. With my equipment in hand, cameras, EMF detectors, and a recorder, I pushed open the heavy front door. It creaked loudly, echoing through the vast emptiness inside. The air was thick with dampness and decay, and a musty odor clung to everything. The place felt like a tomb long forgotten by the world. I began my investigation in the main lobby, setting up cameras to capture any movement. As I walked through the hospital, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The building was massive, a labyrinth of corridors and wards, each one more decrepit than the last. The walls were stained with mold, and the floor was littered with broken glass and debris. I reached the first patient ward and started recording, speaking aloud to the spirits I didn't believe in. If there's anyone here, show yourself. Give me a sign. My voice echoed back, mocking me with its emptiness. Hours passed, and I found nothing, no signs, no apparitions, just the oppressive silence. Frustration gnawed at me as I ventured deeper into the hospital, determined to find something. I reached the psychiatric wing, a place where the most disturbed patients were kept. The stories about this wing were the darkest patients subjected to inhumane treatments, some left to die in isolation. As I entered, my equipment started to malfunction. The EMF detector spiked erratically, and my camera refused to focus. I felt a sudden chill, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something was wrong. Then I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping like fingers drumming on a table. It was coming from one of the rooms down the hall. I followed the sound, my heart pounding, the rational part of my mind fighting against the rising fear. I reached the room, its door slightly ajar. The tapping stopped abruptly as I pushed the door open. Inside, the room was empty, save for an old hospital bed and a single chair facing the window. The air was thick with an unidentifiable scent, something acrid and metallic. I approached the chair, noticing the deep gouges in the floorboards beneath it, as if it had been dragged across the room repeatedly. My breath caught in my throat when I saw the marks on the wall scratches, deep and frantic, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls. Panic surged through me as I tugged at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room grew colder, and the tapping started again, this time coming from everywhere at once surrounding me. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no response, only the sound of the tapping growing louder and more insistent. I felt a presence, something dark and malevolent, pressing in on me from all sides. The lights flickered, casting distorted shadows on the walls. I could feel it now, an entity, something ancient and furious, lingering in the room with me. It was as if the very air was alive, pulsating with anger and despair. Suddenly, I was thrown backward, my body slamming into the wall. Pain shot through me as I crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath. The room was spinning, and the tapping had turned into a deafening roar, a cacophony of rage. I tried to stand, but an invisible force pinned me down, my limbs paralyzed as if held by unseen hands. The air grew thick, suffocating, and I could feel something pressing down on my chest, crushing the life out of me. And then I saw a figure, dark and indistinct, standing in the corner of the room. Its eyes were hollow, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. It watched me with a malevolence that chilled me to my core. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "This is my domain." The figure moved closer, its form shifting and twisting in the flickering light. The pressure on my chest intensified, and I could barely breathe. My vision blurred, and the edges of the room seemed to warp and melt into darkness. I tried to fight back to regain control, but the entity was too powerful. It fed on my fear, growing stronger with every passing second. I could feel its cold, clammy hands wrapping around my throat, squeezing the life out of me. Desperation surged through me, and I reached for the recorder still clutched in my hand. With the last of my strength, I hit the play button, hoping the sound would disrupt whatever was happening. The room filled with my own voice, echoing back at me from the recorder, but instead of disrupting the entity, it seemed to fuel its anger. The figure let out a guttural scream, a sound so horrific it rattled my bones. The walls shook, and the floor beneath me cracked as if the hospital itself was reacting to the entity's fury. The temperature plummeted, and I could see my breath in the air, freezing into crystals as soon as it left my mouth. I was on the brink of losing consciousness when the pressure suddenly lifted. The figure was gone, and the room was silent once more. I gasped for air, my chest heaving as I struggled to comprehend what had just happened. I didn't waste any time. I staggered to my feet, every muscle in my body screaming in pain, and bolted for the door. This time it opened easily, swinging wide as if inviting me to leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran through the hospital, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows stretching and warping in unnatural ways. I could still feel the entity's presence, following me, watching me, waiting for me to falter. I reached the main lobby and practically threw myself through the front doors, the cold night air hitting me like a wave of relief. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I drove away, I glanced back at the hospital one last time. It stood there dark and silent, but I knew it wasn't empty. The entity was still there, waiting for its next victim. I returned home, but the events of that night stayed with me. I reviewed the footage from my cameras, but there was nothing, just static and distorted images. The recorder, however, was different. It had captured something, a voice faint and barely audible beneath my own. "You shouldn't have come here." The words echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of the terror I had faced. I tried to forget, to move on, but the entity wouldn't let me. It haunted my dreams, its hollow eyes and twisted grin appearing every time I closed my eyes. I stopped investigating after that night. The risk was too great, the fear too real. I couldn't shake the feeling that the entity had marked me, that it was only a matter of time before it came for me again. And so I live in constant dread, knowing that the hospital is still out there waiting, and that one day it will call me back. And when it does, I know I won't escape a second time. My name is Kira, and I'm a medical student in my final year. To complete my thesis on the history of psychiatric care, I volunteered to catalog the old records stored in the abandoned Lakeside Hospital. The hospital had been shut down for decades, a relic from a time when mental health care was as primitive as it was cruel. The assignment was supposed to be simple: spend a few days organizing the dusty old files, take notes, and leave. But as I approached the hospital for the first time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a terrible mistake. The building was massive, its once white facade now a crumbling gray husk. The windows were boarded up, and the front entrance was chained shut. I had to enter through a side door, the only accessible point left. The moment I stepped inside, the air grew thick and musty, the scent of mildew and decay overwhelming my senses. The dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls cast eerie shadows on the floor. And the silence was so absolute that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in the vast emptiness. I made my way to the basement, where the hospital's archives were stored. The old records room was a claustrophobic space, filled with towering shelves of patient files, medical journals, and handwritten notes. I set up my laptop on a rickety old desk, the only piece of furniture that hadn't collapsed under the weight of time. As I began sorting through the files, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of dread. The records were disorganized with no apparent system, and many of the files were incomplete or damaged. The patient's stories were horrific accounts of outdated treatments, isolation, and abuse. The deeper I dug, the more unsettling it became. Among the records, I found an old leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn. The journal belonged to Dr. Elias Thorne, one of the hospital's chief physicians in the early 1900s. His name was infamous in the world of psychiatric care, known for his unorthodox and often cruel methods. I opened the journal, my curiosity piqued, and began to read. The first few entries were mundane, detailing his day-to-day work with the patients. But as I continued, the entries grew darker, more disturbing. Dr. Thorne wrote of his experiments on the patients, using them as test subjects for various treatments that bordered on torture. He described his methods in clinical detail with no regard for the suffering of those in his care. As I read, I felt a growing unease as if the words themselves carried a dark energy. One entry in particular caught my attention. It was dated March 3rd, 1910, and described a patient known only as Patient X. According to Dr. Thorne, this patient was unlike any other. He had encountered a woman in her late 20s who exhibited signs of extreme psychosis. She claimed to see and hear things that no one else could, and despite numerous attempts to treat her, nothing seemed to work. Dr. Thorne wrote that he had decided to conduct a final experiment on Patient X, one that would push the boundaries of medical ethics. The details were vague, but he mentioned something about binding the spirit and unlocking the mind's true potential. The entry ended abruptly, with no explanation of what happened next. That night, I decided to stay in the hospital. The weather had taken a turn for the worse, and the thought of driving back in the storm didn't appeal to me. I set up a makeshift bed in one of the old offices near the archives, but sleep didn't come easily. The wind howled outside, and the building creaked and groaned as if it were alive. Around midnight, I awoke to a faint sound like whispering. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened, I realized it was something else. The voices were soft, almost indistinguishable, but they were definitely there, drifting through the air like a sinister lullaby. I got up, my heart pounding in my chest, and followed the sound down the darkened hallway. The hospital felt different at night, the shadows deeper, the air colder. The whispers grew louder as I approached the old records room, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of my phone. I scanned the room, my breath catching in my throat when I saw it. One of the filing cabinets was open, paper scattered across the floor. I was sure I had closed everything before going to bed, but now the room was in disarray. The whispers intensified, filling my head with unintelligible words, a cacophony of voices speaking over one another. My hands trembled as I reached for the journal, which was now lying open on the desk. The pages had flipped to a new entry, one I hadn't seen before. The handwriting was frantic, almost illegible, as if written in a state of panic. It described the final moments of Dr. Thorne's experiment on Patient X. He wrote that something had gone terribly wrong, that the patient had begun to scream uncontrollably, claiming that they were coming for her. The entry ended with a single sentence, scrawled in large, uneven letters, "She's still here." I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I grabbed the journal and fled, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more desperate. I needed to get out of the hospital, to leave and never come back. But as I reached the main floor, I stopped dead in my tracks. The front door was blocked by a heavy iron gate that hadn't been there before. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped. The whispers had become a roar, filling the entire hospital with a maddening noise. And then I saw her Patient X. She stood at the end of the hallway, her figure barely visible in the dim light. Her hair was matted, her clothes torn, and her eyes were wide with terror. She began to walk toward me, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. Her mouth moved, but the words were lost in the cacophony of whispers. I backed away, my mind racing, trying to find a way out. But there was no escape. The hospital had become a labyrinth, the walls shifting, the doors leading to nowhere. Patient X was getting closer, her presence suffocating, the air around her charged with a dark energy. I ran, my heart pounding in my ears, but no matter where I went, she was always there, just behind me, her eyes locked onto mine. I could feel her pain, her anger, her desperation, all of it pressing down on me like a physical weight. Desperate, I found myself back in the basement, standing before the locked door to the hospital's morgue. The whispers were deafening now, the air thick with malevolence. I had nowhere else to go. With trembling hands, I forced the door open and stumbled inside. The air was freezing and the stench of decay was overpowering. The room was filled with old, rusted gurneys, each one holding a covered body. I knew this was where Dr. Thorne had brought patient X, where he had conducted his final, twisted experiment. As I approached the far end of the room, the whispers suddenly stopped. The silence was suffocating, and the only sound was my own ragged breathing. I reached the last gurney and slowly pulled back the sheet. There she was, patient X. Her body was emaciated, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes were closed, but her mouth was open in a silent scream. It was clear that she had died in agony. But as I stood there, something horrifying happened. Her eyes snapped open, and she turned her head to look directly at me. The whispers returned, louder and more frenzied than before, and I felt an overwhelming sense of terror. I tried to back away, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. Patient X slowly sat up, her movements stiff and unnatural. Her gaze was locked onto mine, and I could feel her pulling me toward her, as if she were drawing out my very soul. In that moment, I realized what Dr. Thorne had done. He had bound her spirit to this place, trapping her in a state of eternal torment. And now she wanted to do the same to me. I knew I had to do something, anything, to break the hold she had over me. In a panic, I reached for the journal, flipping through the pages, searching for some kind of answer. But the words were jumbled, incomprehensible, as if they were being rewritten before my eyes. Patient X was now fully standing, her mouth moving in silent incantations, her hands outstretched toward me. I felt a cold, numbing sensation spreading through my body, starting from my fingertips and creeping inward. In a final, desperate act, I grabbed the journal and hurled it into the incinerator at the far end of the room. The old machine roared to life, its flames consuming the brittle pages. The whispers turned to screams, a deafening chorus of agony as the journal burned. Patient X let out a blood-curdling scream, her body convulsing as the flames consumed the last remnants of Dr. Thorne's dark legacy. The room shook and the temperature plummeted, but I could feel the hold on me weakening. With a final, agonized cry, patient X collapsed to the floor, her body dissolving into ash. The whispers ceased and the air grew still. I was free. I left the hospital that night, shaken and forever changed. The front gate was gone, the building once again a silent, decaying ruin. I never spoke of what happened to anyone. The journal's ashes remained in the incinerator, the last evidence of Dr. Thorne's twisted experiments. But I knew the truth. The hospital wasn't just haunted, it was a place of profound darkness, a prison for tortured souls. And while I had escaped, I knew that others might not be so lucky. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see patient X standing there, watching me. But the road was empty, the hospital receding into the distance. I vowed never to return, but the memory of that night still haunts me. I can't shake the feeling that somewhere in the shadows of that abandoned hospital, something is still waiting, watching, and it will never rest.